I'm Diane Cleaver. I am from Kansas City, Missouri, and I am CEO of the Urban Neighborhood Initiative, pleased to be a member of the wonderful network of purpose-built communities. Our organization works with 10 neighborhoods in the urban heart of our city, and one of them is a purpose-built community where we are about to embark on building mixed-income residents like the rest of you. So we are very excited to be part of the network, and I am very excited to be here this evening in this role. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Richard Rothstein, who we are very excited to have him with us tonight. Mr. Rothstein has been one of the most important voices in our country around issues of poverty, race, housing, education, and segregation, all issues that are core to our work and very important to our country as a whole. As an education researcher and writer, he long ago, before many of us were doing so, challenged us to think about education outcomes in the context of poverty. He has also educated us on how the laws and policies of our own federal government have shaped the racial segregation, income inequality, and disparate incomes we see in our cities today. We will hear more about that shortly. But we know that these issues are critical to the discussion that we need to have if we're ever going to understand the issues of equity and how to achieve that equity that we all talk about. We are also very excited to share that as of today, we, Purpose-Built Communities, released a special episode of the Purpose-Built Communities podcast. This is Community, which is the name of the podcast, which features a conversation between Mr. Rothstein and Mayor Shirley Franklin. You can download it and listen to it on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It will also be on the Purpose-Built Communities website. Please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, Diane. And thanks to all of you for the wonderful work that you do and for coming here today to engage in conversations with each other and with me. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had the civil rights movement in this country. It actually began with civil rights lawyers challenging the segregation of law schools because they figured that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to understand an argument that you couldn't get a good legal education in an inferior and segregated law school. And then they moved on from there to address segregation in colleges and universities. And as you all know, in 1954, in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And the Brown decision inspired, motivated, reinforced a generation of activists, civil rights activists, who engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives. But at the end of the 1960s, by the end of the 1960s, we'd abolished segregation and water fountains, swimming pools, lunch counters, buses, interstate transportation, public accommodations. And yet, we left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. We're an apartheid society. We have clearly defined areas that are white or almost all white, clearly defined areas that are black or almost all black. We came as a country to understand in the 20th century that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to blacks and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. And yet, we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. How could that be? Well, partly it's harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains. You pass a law prohibiting the segregation of water fountains, and the next day you can drink from any water fountain. But you pass a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, and the next day things don't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I include myself and you, what we've done, all of us, is we've invented an excuse, a rationalization we give ourselves for having addressed segregation in all these other spheres of American life, but not in neighborhoods. And that excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves, well, the segregation of schools or colleges or water fountains or swimming pools, that was all done by government. It was the result of laws, of regulations, of public policy, of ordinances. If the federal government was doing it, it was violating the Fifth Amendment. It was a civil rights violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it was violating the 14th Amendment, also civil rights violations. If we have a civil rights violation, we're obligated to remedy it if we take our constitutional responsibilities seriously. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law or regulation or public policy. That just sort of happened by accident. It happened because, bigoted homeowners wouldn't sell homes in white neighborhoods to African Americans, or maybe real estate agents wouldn't show it to them, or actors in the private economy like banks and real estate agents discriminated in how they carried out their purely private economic activity. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because blacks and whites both like to live with each other, the same race. They feel more comfortable that way. And that's why we have segregation. Or maybe it's just the result of income differences, not something that's intentional, but just the natural result of the fact that, on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so they live in separate neighborhoods. All of these individual, perhaps bigoted, but non-governmental decisions is what's created residential segregation, and we tell ourselves, what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. It's not our responsibility to do something about it because it's not a civil rights violation. It wasn't done by government. Well, as Diane said, I spent many years writing about education policy. And in the course of that work, I came to denounce, really, in many of my writings, the education policy that we were following in the country in the 1990s and 2000s. We had a theory, it was a bipartisan theory, that the reason that we had an achievement gap between black and white children was because teachers of black children had lower expectations of their students. They didn't try hard enough. And if only we tested children more and held teachers accountable for the children's test performance, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought it was a ludicrous theory, and yet it was supported by liberals like Ted Kennedy and George Miller, by Republicans like President George Bush. We passed a law in 2001 that required extensive testing of children and held schools and teachers accountable for their test scores, and the expectation that in just a few years the achievement gap would disappear. And I tried to explain in the columns I was writing and in the articles I was writing why I thought this was a silly theory, and it was bound to fail as it did fail. And I remember one column I wrote was about asthma. Excuse me. Well, we know that African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. Because so many of them live in more polluted neighborhoods, less well-maintained homes, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, there's a good chance the child will be up at night wheezing, maybe come to school drowsy the next day, or sleepy. And I tried to explain, if you have 2 groups of children who are identical, 2 identical groups of children, same racial makeup, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, and that group is going to come to school on average slightly sleepier than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement no matter how high teacher expectations are, and testing them more isn't going to make them more wide awake. And I went through example after example of the kinds of conditions that children come to school with from low-income neighborhoods, asthma lead poisoning that has a measurable impact on cognitive ability, stress, homelessness. Each of them you can do the same kind of syllogism, two groups of children equal in every respect except for this one characteristic, and they'll have lower average achievement. And that's the reason we have an achievement gap, not because of teacher low expectations. Well, this is what I was thinking about, and I'm a slow learner, so it took me a while, too long to realize that it's one thing if a child comes to school with asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or chronic stress. What happens when you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or chronic stress? How can that school ever be expected to achieve at the same level of a school where children come to school healthy and well-rested and in stable homes? It's impossible. Well, we call those schools where we concentrate children in with those kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 50 years in this country. More segregated, despite the abolition of legal segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. And I thought about it a little bit more, and gradually it dawned on me, as I say, I don't learn too quickly, but gradually it dawned on me that the reason that these schools are segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So neighborhood segregation must be an educational issue, not just a housing issue. Well, this is what I was thinking about as an education policy analyst in 2007 when I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program that two school districts were pursuing, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those school districts had a very, very token desegregation plan. Both districts gave parents in the district a choice of which school within the district their child could attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who did not. So if you had, for example, a school that was all white or mostly white, and you had one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for it, the black child would be given some preference. It wasn't a forced program. The children had to apply, but the black child would be given some preference. Well, the Supreme Court looked at this program that both Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky were following, denounced it, said it couldn't be done. It was a violation of the Constitution to do such a thing because Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. He said, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he observed the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That's, in fact, why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And then he went on to say that the reason that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated is for the reason I said before: private discrimination, actors in the private economy, income differences, self-choice. And he gave a name to it, a name that we all use. Everyone in this room, I did, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans. He said this is de facto segregation. Segregation that just happened in fact. And if you have de facto segregation, there's nothing you can do about it, nothing you're permitted to do about it under the Constitution, because it had to be created by government in order for government to have a role in undoing it. Well, I read this decision. I remembered, while reading it, something I had read about many years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts that was involved in this decision. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner had a friend, an African-American friend, who was living in the center city of Louisville. The friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife, a child, wanted to live in a single-family home. He had a middle-class job. He could afford one, but no one would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows, but the police couldn't somehow stop this. They dynamited and firebombed the home, and the police were somehow unable to stop it from happening. But yet, when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence. The white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the courts, the prosecutors, the whole criminal justice system is being employed to maintain racial boundaries. So I began to look into it further. I discovered that this was not an isolated incident. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, of incidents in cities across the country, north, midwest, west, south, of police-protected mob violence driving African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased in previously white neighborhoods. Every one of them, where the police was involved, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment that's never been remedied. And I began to look into it further and began to do the research that led to this book, The Color of Law, and I discovered that it wasn't just the criminal justice system that was violating the Constitution by enforcing racial segregation, but there were many, many racially explicit federal, state, and local policies practiced in the 20th century that were well known at the time, nothing hidden about them, and without which we would not have the segregation that we know today. So let me, in the few minutes I have this evening, describe some of the most important federal policies. Federal I'm going to emphasize, but there are many state and local as well that I describe in my book. Policies that the federal government used to create, enforce, and sustain racial segregation. One of them I'll begin with is public housing. Some of you may know the history of public housing, but I think few of us do. We think of public housing, as I did, we think of public housing as a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men living there without jobs in the formal economy, perhaps getting engaged in confrontations with the police. That's not how public housing began in this country. When public housing began in this country, in the New Deal, during the Roosevelt administration and the Depression, it was not for poor people. We had a lot of unemployment in the Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had good, stable jobs and ongoing employment, who could pay the full cost of housing and their rent, but for whom no housing was available because nothing was being built in the Depression. The first New Deal agency, the Public Works Administration, built public housing frequently, and I mean frequently, creating segregation with its public housing that hadn't previously existed. The very first public housing project that the federal government ever built, the Public Works Administration, here in Atlanta, the first one, in a neighborhood near downtown Atlanta called the Flats, that was an integrated neighborhood. Integrated. In the mid-20th century, we had lots of integrated working-class neighborhoods in this country. We would all be stunned if we were transported back to that period to see the extent of normal working-class integration that existed. For the simple reason, if you think about it, you realize it had to be. We were a manufacturing economy at the time, none of this internet stuff. You know, people were making things, they had factories. And factories had to be located near either a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts and ship their final products. So there had to be a central factory district. They couldn't be spread out in the suburbs, there was no way to get there. And if you had a factory district that employed both black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. And that was the case in the Flats in Atlanta. Well, the Public Works Administration demolished housing here in the Flats and built a project for whites only in a previously integrated neighborhood. The African Americans who had been living there were displaced, had to double, triple up with relatives, find housing, probably less adequate housing elsewhere. And the federal government did this everywhere in the country, that it built public housing during the Depression. Always for working class families who could pay the cost of housing and their rent, and always segregated. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, whom I'm sure you all know, Langston Hughes, wrote in his autobiography, The Big C, that he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of Cleveland, downtown Cleveland today. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It's what you would expect in an integrated high school, living in an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built separate projects, one for whites, one for blacks, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed, and that would not exist to that extent today, were it not for that policy with those projects and others in the Cleveland metropolitan area. In my book, I like, where possible, to pick on self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than the rest of us. One of my favorites, maybe some of you are familiar with it, is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. But the Public Works Administration built two separate projects, one for whites only, one for blacks only, creating a pattern of segregation with those projects and with others in the Boston metropolitan area that largely determined the future racial growth of that city, that metropolitan area. During World War II, the efforts of the federal government to create segregation grew even more intense. And the best example here, although it was done everywhere in the country, is the West Coast. There were hundreds of thousands of workers during World War II who flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in the war industry, the jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. The government, if it wanted the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft carriers, the planes to be built, had to somehow find housing for these workers who were overwhelming the communities where these plants were located. And so the government did, the federal government built housing for war workers, everywhere segregating it, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Some of you I know, I've met some of you in the reception earlier, are from the West Coast. West Coast is a great example of this because, as some of you who know American history know, historians divide up the migration of African Americans from the former slave-holding states to the rest of the country into two periods. The first great migration that brought African Americans to places like Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh and New York. And the second great migration, which brought workers, African Americans, for the first time to the West Coast. There were very few African Americans living in the West Coast before World War II. So when the government built housing on a segregated basis during World War II on the West Coast, it was creating segregation where there was not even an informal pattern of segregation existing prior to that. Everywhere it built it, it created segregated housing for war workers. San Francisco, the federal government built five projects for war workers. 4 were in white neighborhoods for white workers only. 1 was in what's now known as the Fillmore District for African Americans. Explicitly designated projects. This is not because African Americans happen to like to live with one another in the project in the Fillmore District, and whites happen to like to live with each other in these other projects. These were explicitly designated projects. There was one at the Hunters Point Dry Dock where the city of San Francisco proposed that the housing be integrated, and the Navy prohibited it from doing so, insisted that the housing be segregated. And this is how Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, as well as San Francisco, came to be segregated with patterns that persist to this day. After World War II, we still had an enormous housing shortage. Not only had nothing been built during the Depression, except for these few Public Works Administration and other federal projects, during World War II it was unlawful to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless they were for war workers. And then after the war, millions of returning war veterans are coming home needing housing. We had the kind of homelessness crisis that we have today. There was this big backlog of housing and millions of families being formed needing housing for whom there was no housing available. People were living in open fields, in Quonset huts, doubled, tripled up with relatives. President Truman felt that he had to respond to this homelessness crisis, and so he proposed a vast expansion of the nation's public housing stock. Again, not for poor people. These were returning war veterans mostly, who had jobs in the post-war economy, in the boom. They just couldn't find any housing. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's public housing expansion. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons, because public housing, it was understood, was always going to be segregated, and they didn't mind that. And I'm not talking about the South, across the country, it was going to be segregated. It's not because they didn't like poor people. Public housing wasn't for poor people. It was working class families, returning war veterans. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. The government shouldn't be involved in the housing market. It should be taken care of by the private sector. Not that the private sector was doing anything to address the housing shortage of returning veterans. But they came up with a device, something that some of you may have heard of or be familiar with the term, a device to defeat the bill which is called a poison pill strategy. I don't know how many of you have heard that term, poison pill strategy, but it's a strategy where opponents of a bill in Congress propose an amendment to the bill that they think can gain a majority. And then when the full bill comes up on the floor of the House and the Senate, that very amendment makes it unacceptable to a different majority, and the entire bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed the following amendment to the 1949 Housing Act, led by Mr. Conservative, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. The amendment said that from now on, there can't be any more racial discrimination in public housing. No more segregated public housing. It was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they planned to vote en masse for this non-discrimination amendment. They thought they could get Northern liberals to join them in voting for the amendment. That would create a majority. The amendment would then be attached to the 1949 Housing Act. And then when the full bill came up before the floor in the Senate as a bill requiring non-segregated public housing, the conservatives would flip it against and vote against the final bill. They would then be joined by Southern Democrats, who are all in favor of non-segregated, segregated public housing, but not non-segregated public housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. That was their strategy. So Northern liberals had to decide what to do. They had a devil's bargain that they were faced with. Were they going to play into this game and support the non-discrimination amendment with the inevitable result that no housing would be built to address the serious homelessness crisis that was existed in the country? Or would they vote against the integration amendment, ensuring that there would be an effort to address the housing crisis, albeit on a segregated basis? I'm not suggesting that they faced an easy choice. It was a difficult choice they had to make. But I'm telling you this story in some detail because it's the same choice that we face today in this country. Exactly the same choice. Well, led by the leading liberal in the Senate at that time, Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois, and his colleague, a fellow who was called Mr. Civil Rights, the senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, they decided to campaign against the integration amendment in order to preserve the expansion of public housing. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends, you'll be better off with the housing bill without the integration amendment because you'll get the housing that you need than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, they succeeded. Liberals didn't vote for the integration amendment. The integration amendment failed. The full bill came up on the floor of the House and Senate as an ongoing segregated program, and it was passed. The federal government then used that vote against the amendment as its justification for continuing to segregate explicitly all federal housing programs for the next 15 years, taking us into the 1960s, pretty recent history. And under this program, the vast expansion of public housing that we're familiar with the giant towers in many cities, in Chicago, you know them, Robert Taylor Homes, or Cabrini Green, or St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe Homes. Pruitt-Igoe is actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. Not because African Americans liked the sound of the name Pruitt and whites liked the sound of the name Igoe. That's not how it happened. It was explicit federal segregation. Well, I'm not so sure. I know it was a difficult choice. It was as I say, devil's bargain. I don't know how you would have voted if you were in the Senate or House at that time, but I'm not so sure that Senator Douglas was right, that anyone was better off as a result of that bargain that we made at that time. Because as a result of the intense reinforcement of segregation that act resulted in, we not only had the achievement gap that I described at the beginning, we would concentrate the most disadvantaged children in single schools. We have health disparities that many of you are familiar with. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, in large part from living, so many of them, in dangerous neighborhoods. We have the mass incarceration outrage that we have in this country that exists only because we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men without jobs in the formal economy in single neighborhoods, where they engage in effect warfare with the police. Couldn't happen if they weren't so concentrated. And I think that the result of that devil's bargain is the very, very dangerous, frightening to me, and I think to many of you, political polarization that we have in this country today. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines, as you know. And I don't know how we can ever develop the common national identity that's essential to preserving this democracy if so many African Americans and so many whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to identify with each other or to understand each other's life experiences. So that was the choice that we made, and we make the same choice today. As you know, we have a number of affordable housing programs in this country. Disproportionately, we place affordable housing for low-income families in already low-income neighborhoods with the idea that that placement is going to somehow improve the neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation. It's easier to build affordable housing in already segregated low-income neighborhoods, and that's why we do it. The same reasoning that Paul Douglas used in 1949, but we pay a price for it. Well, under that 1949 Act, as I said, the vast expansion of public housing occurred, and very soon afterwards, a development happened that was surprising to policy experts, to people like all of us in this room, to housing experts. All of a sudden, the white projects, like IGO in St. Louis, developed large numbers of vacancies, and the black projects developed long waiting lists. Pretty soon, even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of his projects in the same city were half empty and the others had long waiting lists. So all the projects were opened up to African Americans in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Pretty soon it became a predominantly African American institution. And then the African Americans living in public housing became poorer, no longer working class families with jobs in the formal economy, because the factories that used to have to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals disappeared. They moved out to the suburbs because now there were highways being built and they could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. The residents of public housing, now predominantly African American, could no longer pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. Government began to subsidize the housing. It became a welfare program that we know today. Once that happened, the government stopped investing in it, stopped maintaining it, the projects deteriorated, and that's how we got the kind of public housing that all of us think we're familiar with, but that's not how public housing began. Well, the question that I hope is arising in your minds, and it's the main question that I try to address in my book, is why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects and not in the black ones? And that was because of another federal program that was even more powerful in creating segregation than the public housing program. And that was a racially explicit design of the federal government to move the white working class population of this country out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. It was an explicit racial policy. And you're familiar with the suburbs that were created as a result of this policy. We were not a suburban country before the mid-20th century. The most famous of these suburbs is Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Some of you may remember hearing a song that Malvina Rhodes, Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. I can't see all of you because of the lights in my face, but I see a few people in the front nodding. You've heard that song. That was a development. That was about a development south of San Francisco that was just about as large as Levittown. That was 15,000 homes. Where was Levitt going to get the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? No bank was going to be crazy enough to lend him that money. They didn't even think anybody would buy those houses. Who wants to live in the suburbs? It's a crazy idea. Levitt, the only way he could get the money to buy the land and build the project, the only way that Henry Dolger, who was the builder of the little boxes, could get the money and buy the land, was to go to the federal government, submit their plans for the developments. Plans had to include the construction materials they were going to use in the architectural design, the layout of the streets, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt and Dolger and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suburban developers who created suburban rings, white nooses around every metropolitan area in this country, even required them to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written out explicitly in the federal underwriting manual that was given to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to recommend proposals of developers for federal bank guarantees. The manual not only prohibited the recommendation for a federal bank guarantee of a proposal that would result in an integrated housing development, it even prohibited the recommendation of a bank guarantee for a developer who wanted to build an all-white development, but that was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would, quote, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This de facto notion has no basis in reality whatsoever. It's utter mythology, and all of us have accepted it. There's nothing de facto about this. Our residential segregation today in this country is as much a constitutional violation as the segregation of lunch counters or water fountains or buses. But because we don't recognize this history, because of this myth that we've developed, we have accepted no responsibility to address it. Well, the policies to address racial segregation are well known. They need, in my view, to have two different foci, because there are two important consequences of the segregation that we, all of us, have created. One is the lack of resources that create healthy communities in places that are presently have an over-concentration of low-income minority families. That's something that many of you are working on, and it's admirable work. The other is opening up the exclusive communities that were unconstitutionally created and those rings around urban areas to diverse residences. Both of those, as I say, objectives, the policies to achieve them are well known. Housing experts know what they are. Policymakers know what they are. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to demand the enactment of these policies, because all of the policy development in the world is not going to achieve these results unless there's a popular demand, just as there was a popular demand eventually as a result of the disruption of the 1960s that the civil rights movement then created. The policies, I'll give a few and then I'll stop and we can have a discussion about it. Policies, as I say, are well known. Exclusionary zoning ordinances in suburbs that prohibit the construction of anything but single-family homes, often on large lot sizes. In my view, those are unconstitutional. They exist to perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation, and they should be subject to challenge. We won't challenge them without a popular demand that we do so. And if we did challenge them, if we did abolish those zoning ordinances, then it would be possible to build affordable housing in all kinds of communities. Not that we shouldn't build them in existing low-income communities, but we should build them all over, challenging the exclusivity of the white suburbs. We should be resisting mass displacement that results from gentrification. Frequently, what's happening today is gentrification displaces so many people that we simply move the disadvantaged low-income concentrated community from one place to another as a neighborhood becomes segregated at high-income levels rather than at low-income ones. We know what the policies to redress that are. We should have rent control policies. We should have limits on condominium conversions. We should freeze property taxes for existing homeowners. So many homeowners in existing segregated African-American communities are forced out even though they fully own their homes. They no longer owe anything on them because they no longer pay the property taxes on them. We should be freezing property taxes for existing homeowners. And we don't need to do that at a cost to the local treasury because we can recoup the lost property taxes at point of sale. But so long as people want to remain in their homes, they should be able to do so. So those policies are, as I say, are well known. We should, to take an extreme example, it shouldn't be considered extreme actually because it makes perfect sense, but in the suburbs that I was describing before, that were created by the federal government on an exclusive basis, those homes at the time, Levittown or the little boxes south of San Francisco, they sold at the time for $9,000, $10,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Easily affordable to black and white working class families, but open only to the whites. Well, today those homes no longer sell for $100,000. As you all know, you can't buy a house in Levittown or south of San Francisco for $100,000 today. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, sometimes twice that. It's an unconstitutional result. It results, by the way, in another consequence of segregation, in addition to the achievement gap and the health disparities and the mass incarceration and the political polarization, in a wealth gap. White families who bought those homes gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of those homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance medical emergencies or perhaps temporary unemployment. They used it to bequeath wealth to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. That 60% income ratio is itself the creation, in large part, of government policy. I don't have time to talk about that history this evening. You'll have to invite me back some other time to talk about the income gap. That's an entirely different subject. But just take from me the 60% income gap. You'd think that if there's a 60% income gap, there'd be a 60% wealth gap as well. There should be a relationship between the two. But in reality, while there's a 60% income ratio between black and white family incomes, there's a 10% wealth ratio between black and white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that's never been remedied. Well, how could we remedy it? Well, the federal government, in order to remedy its unconstitutional civil rights violation, should be buying up homes in those places at market rates, $500,000, whatever it is, and reselling it to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would, don't laugh. You know, I give a talk like this. I give a talk like this to the American Bar Association, and there's not a single lawyer who will say that's not a perfectly legitimate remedy for a constitutional violation if the constitutional violation was acknowledged. So those are the kinds of things we should be doing, but we won't be doing them unless there's a new civil rights movement to demand it. I commend the work that you're doing. Mixed income housing and creating healthy communities where they are not presently healthy is an essential part of this work. But to supplement this work, we need to mobilize citizens to create the political pressure that's going to demand that local authorities agree to the proposals that you make and fund them. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I understand we do have time for questions, and I'd be glad to engage in as much discussion as you want. Thank you.